She collapsed at his door with nothing but the clothes on her back and a bullet scar that told of violence she couldn't remember. But when his 5-year-old daughter looked into the stranger's eyes and whispered, "Mama," for the first time since her mother's death, everything changed. What dark past was Elena Marlowe running from, and why did little Clara recognize something in her that even Elena herself had forgotten? Stay with us until the very end to discover the shocking truth that will change this family forever. And don't forget to comment below with your city so we can see how far our story travels around the world. The wind howled like a banshee across the Colorado high country, driving snow so thick that Jacob Renfield could barely see the barn from his kitchen window. He pulled his woolen coat tighter and checked the fire one more time, grateful for the solid walls of his ranch house that held back the fury of the 1878 winter storm. "Papa?" Clara's small voice drifted from the top of the stairs. At 5 years old, she still woke frightened when the wind screamed too loud, still reached for a mother who would never answer. "Just a storm, little bird," Jacob called back, his voice rough with the weariness that had settled into his bones since Margaret's death 2 years ago. "Go back to sleep." But even as he said the words, something made him pause. Between the shrieking gusts, he could have sworn he heard something else, a sound that didn't belong to the wilderness symphony of wind and creaking timber. Knock, knock, knock. Jacob froze his hand halfway to the poker beside the fireplace. Nobody traveled in weather like this. Nobody with any sense anyway. The nearest town was 15 miles through mountain passes that could kill a man in fair weather, let alone in a blizzard that had been raging for 3 days straight. Knock, knock, knock. The sound came again, weaker, this time barely audible above the storm's roar. Jacob's weathered hand closed around the rifle he kept by the door. In this remote corner of Colorado territory, unexpected visitors after dark usually meant trouble-claim jumpers, cattle rustlers, or worse. He'd learned to be cautious the hard way, especially with Clara sleeping upstairs. "Who's there?" he called out, not opening the door. Nothing but wind answered. Jacob waited, counting heartbeats, listening. Maybe it had been a branch blown against the house or ice falling from the eaves. God knew the storm was throwing everything but the kitchen sink at them. Then he heard it so faint he almost missed it, a voice barely stronger than a whisper. "Please, help." Every instinct told him to keep that door barred. But something in that voice, something broken and desperate, cut through his caution like a knife through butter. Against his better judgment, Jacob lifted the heavy wooden beam that secured the door and pulled it open. The wind nearly tore the door from his hands, and snow swirled into his warm kitchen like a living thing. But there, collapsed on his doorstep, was a woman. She was more ghost than flesh. Her long dark hair plastered with ice, her lips blue with cold. Her dress, what was left of it, was torn and soaked through, offering no protection against the killing wind. She must have walked miles through the storm. How she was still breathing was beyond Jacob's understanding. "Sweet Jesus," he muttered, setting his rifle aside and dropping to one knee beside her. Up close, he could see she was young, maybe 25, with delicate features that spoke of better times. But her hands were raw and bleeding, her fingernails torn from clawing through snow and ice. Her eyes fluttered open, the palest green he'd ever seen, like winter sage in morning frost. For a moment, they held his gaze with startling intensity. I don't want much," she whispered, her voice barely audible. "Just scraps from your table, and a corner to sleep. In the barn would be fine." Jacob felt something twist in his chest. Pride, maybe, or dignity in tatters. He recognized it because he'd felt it himself in the dark days after Margaret's death. This woman was asking for charity, but she was asking for it like a queen forced to beg. "Ma'am, you'll freeze to death in the barn," he said, already slipping his arms under her. She was light as a child, all sharp angles and fragile bones. "Let's get you inside before we both turn into ice sculptures." He lifted her easily, and carried her into the warmth of his kitchen, kicking the door shut behind them. As he laid her on the old quilt by the fire, she tried to protest. I can't pay, she started, but Jacob cut her off with a wave of his hand. Nobody's talking about payment, he said gruffly. Right now, we're talking about keeping you breathing. He bustled around the kitchen, heating water, finding dry clothes that had belonged to Margaret, trying not to think too hard about why he was helping a complete stranger. Maybe it was because she'd asked for so little. Maybe it was because anyone traveling alone in weather like this was either desperate or crazy, and she didn't look crazy. Or maybe it was because for the first time in 2 years, his empty house felt like it had life in it again. What's your name? He asked as he handed her a cup of hot broth. Her hands shook as she took it, and for a long moment she stared into the steaming liquid as if she might find answers there. Elena, she said finally. Elena Marlowe. The pause before her surname was so slight he almost missed it. Almost. Jacob had been a soldier once before he'd been a rancher, and he'd learned to notice the spaces between words where lies lived. But he said nothing. A person's past was their own business, especially when they were half dead on your doorstep. I'm Jacob Renfield, he offered. This is my ranch, the Double R. My daughter Clara and I work it alone. Elena's eyes flickered with something surprise, maybe, or concern. Your wife. Dead 2 years come spring, Jacob said simply. It still hurt to say it, but the sharp edge had worn smooth with repetition. Fever took her. I'm sorry. The words were quiet, but they carried weight. This was a woman who understood loss. They sat in comfortable silence for a while, listening to the storm rage outside. Elena sipped her broth slowly, color gradually returning to her face. But Jacob noticed her eyes kept darting to the windows, to the door, like a wild animal checking escape routes. You running from something? He asked finally, his voice gentle but direct. Elena's hands tightened around the cup. I don't know. There was truth in those words, but it was a strange kind of truth, like someone telling you the sky was blue while standing in the dark. Before Jacob could press further, the soft sound of bare feet on wooden stairs made them both look up. Clara stood at the bottom of the staircase in her white nightgown, her blonde hair tousled from sleep. She'd inherited Margaret's delicate features and Jacob's stubborn chin, and normally she was shy around strangers to the point of hiding behind his legs. But not tonight. Tonight Clara walked straight to Elena as if drawn by invisible strings, her blue eyes so much like her mother's fixed on the strange woman's face with an intensity that made Jacob's breath catch. Clara, honey, go back to bed, he said softly. This is Miss Elena. She's just visiting. But Clara didn't listen. She stopped directly in front of Elena, studying her with the serious concentration that only children possessed. Elena, for her part, had gone very still, her green eyes wide and uncertain. Then Clara reached out one small hand and touched Elena's cheek, just below a faded bruise that Jacob hadn't noticed in the firelight. You're hurt, Clara said in her clear, sweet voice. A little. Elena admitted, her voice unsteady. Clara nodded sagely, as if this explained everything. Then she did something that stopped Jacob's heart cold. She climbed into Elena's lap, curled up against her chest, like a kitten seeking warmth, and whispered the word she hadn't spoken in 2 years. Mama. The cup slipped from Elena's nerveless fingers, but Jacob caught it before it could hit the floor. His own hands were shaking now because Clara hadn't just said the word, she'd said it like she meant it, like she'd been waiting her whole life to say it to this particular stranger. Elena's arms came up automatically to hold the child, and Jacob saw something flicker across her face. Recognition, maybe, or memory trying to surface. Her hands, so careful and gentle, smoothed Clara's hair with practiced ease. Clara, Jacob said, his voice hoarse. Sweetheart, you can't just... She smells like home. Clara interrupted, her face buried against Elena's shoulder. like when Mama used to sing to me. Jacob felt the world tilt sideways. Margaret had smelled like lavender and fresh bread, like sunshine and Saturday morning pancakes. This stranger smelled like snow and fear and something else, something familiar that he couldn't quite place. But Clara was already settling deeper into Elena's embrace, her eyes growing heavy, with the peculiar trust that children reserved for those they instinctively knew were safe. Within minutes, she was asleep, breathing softly against Elena's shoulder. Elena looked up at Jacob, her eyes filled with a mixture of wonder and terror. "I should go," she whispered. "I shouldn't be here. She shouldn't. I don't understand why she—" "Neither do I," Jacob admitted. But looking at his daughter, truly peaceful for the first time since Margaret's death, he found himself saying words that surprised him. "But maybe that doesn't matter right now." "You don't understand," Elena said urgently, but quietly, careful not to wake Clara. "I don't remember. There are things missing, pieces. What if I'm dangerous? What if I'm not who I think I am?" Jacob studied her face in the firelight, the delicate bone structure, the way she held Clara like she was made of spun glass, the unconscious maternal gestures that seemed to come from somewhere deeper than memory. "Are you dangerous?" he asked. Elena's laugh was broken bitter. "I don't know. That's the problem. I don't know anything. The last clear memory I have is waking up in a ditch outside Denver 3 weeks ago with blood in my hair and no idea how I got there." The admission hung between them like a challenge. Jacob should have been reaching for his rifle, should have been putting distance between this woman and his daughter. Everything logical in his farmer's brain was screaming warnings, but Clara was sleeping so peacefully, and Elena was holding her like she'd done it 1,000 times before. "What do you remember?" Jacob asked instead. Elena's brow furrowed with concentration. "Fragments, the sound of gunshots, running through snow that looked just like this. Someone calling my name, but not Elena, something else." She paused, her hand still stroking Clara's hair, "and singing. I remember singing lullabies, but I don't know where or when or to whom. Maybe to a child of your own." The question made Elena flinch. "I don't know. I don't think so. But the songs are so clear, like I've sung them 100 times. She looked down at Clara. "When she called me, when she said that word, something moved in my chest. Like recognition, but deeper." Jacob was quiet for a long moment, watching the interplay of firelight and shadow on Elena's face. There were secrets there, dark ones, but he was beginning to suspect they were secrets she kept even from herself. "The storm's getting worse," he said finally. "You can't travel in this weather, and I won't send anyone out into that cold to die. Whatever you're running from, whatever you've forgotten, it'll have to wait until the weather breaks." "Jacob, you don't understand. I understand that my daughter is sleeping peacefully for the first time in 2 years. Jacob interrupted, his voice firm but not unkind. "I understand that whoever you were before you walked through that door, right now you're a woman in need of help. And I understand that sometimes the right thing to do is the thing that doesn't make sense." Elena stared at him for a long moment, and he could see her working through the implications. The risks, the weight of accepting charity from strangers. "Just until the storm passes," she said finally. "Just until the storm passes." Jacob agreed. But as he helped her settle Clara in the small bedroom off the kitchen, Margaret's old sewing room that had been closed up since her death, Jacob had the peculiar feeling that this storm, whatever it was, would be a long time in passing. Elena tucked Clara in with movements so natural they might have been performed in dreams, humming softly under her breath. The melody was hauntingly familiar, something Margaret used to sing, though Jacob couldn't place where Elena might have learned it. "Sleep tight, little bird," Elena whispered, using Jacob's own pet name for his daughter. Clara stirred just enough to whisper back, "Night, night, Mama." And there it was again, that word that changed everything, spoken with the absolute certainty that only children possessed. Elena's hand trembled as she smoothed the blanket one last time. When they returned to the kitchen, Jacob saw that Elena was swaying on her feet, exhaustion finally claiming her now that the crisis had passed. "You need rest," he said. "Real rest, not whatever you've been getting these past 3 weeks." "I can sleep by the fire," Elena offered. "I don't want to be any more trouble." "You'll sleep in a proper bed," Jacob cut her off. "Margaret's room, I mean the main bedroom. I haven't used it since I sleep in the loft now." Elena started to protest again, but Jacob held up a hand. "You asked for scraps and a corner to sleep," he said, echoing her earlier words. "But this isn't charity anymore. This is Clara choosing something I don't understand, but can't ignore. So for tonight, for as long as this storm lasts, you're not a stranger asking for help. You're whatever Clara needs you to be." The words surprised him as he spoke them, but they felt true in a way that defied explanation. Elena's eyes filled with tears. She tried to blink away. "I don't deserve this kindness," she whispered. "Maybe not," Jacob said gently. "But Clara does. She deserves to sleep without nightmares. She deserves to feel safe. And for some reason I can't fathom, you make her feel both of those things." Elena nodded slowly, acceptance and gratitude warring in her expression. As she climbed the stairs to the bedroom that had been empty for 2 years, Jacob banked the fire and checked the locks one more time. Outside, the wind was beginning to die down, but the snow continued to fall in thick, silent sheets. By morning, they'd be snowed in for days, maybe weeks. Plenty of time to figure out what to do about the mysterious woman who'd collapsed on his doorstep and somehow convinced his daughter she was home. Jacob settled into his chair by the dying fire, his rifle across his knees, and listened to the old house settle around its new occupant. Upstairs, he could hear Elena moving quietly around Margaret's room, and from the small bedroom came Clara's soft, even breathing, the sound of a child sleeping without fear for the first time in memory. Whatever Elena Marlowe was running from, whatever secrets she carried in the empty spaces of her memory, Jacob found himself hoping the storm would last a long time. Because for the first time since Margaret's death, the Double R Ranch felt like a home again. And if there was danger in that hope, if there was foolishness in trusting a woman who couldn't remember her own past, well, some risks were worth taking. Some storms were worth weathering, even if you couldn't see the other side. As the fire burned down to embers and snow continued to fall like forgiveness. Over the Colorado high country, Jacob Renfield made a decision that would change all their lives. He would give this broken woman and his wounded daughter time to heal each other, whatever the cost. Some gifts, after all, came disguised as strangers in the snow. And some families were born not of blood, but of need and hope and the simple act of opening your door to someone who had nowhere else to go. The storm raged on, but inside the Double R Ranch, 3 souls who had been lost were beginning to find their way home to each other, one hesitant, hopeful moment at a time. The storm broke on the 4th day, leaving the world transformed under 3 feet of pristine snow that sparkled like diamonds in the morning sun. Jacob woke to the sound of laughter, real laughter drifting up from the kitchen below, a sound so foreign to his house that for a moment he thought he was dreaming. But as he dressed and made his way downstairs, he found Clara perched on a chair beside the stove, chattering away to Elena as if they'd known each other all their lives. Elena was flipping pancakes with practiced ease, her dark hair caught up in one of Margaret's old ribbons, and she was smiling, not the careful, guarded expression she'd worn that first night, but something genuine and warm. "Papa," Clara called out when she spotted him. "Elena makes funny shapes. Look, it's a horse." She held up a pancake that did indeed resemble something 4-legged, though Jacob wasn't entirely convinced it was equine. Elena glanced over her shoulder at him, a faint blush coloring her cheeks. "I hope you don't mind," she said quietly. "Clara was hungry, and I thought—" "I don't mind," Jacob said, and meant it. The kitchen smelled like butter and maple syrup and Something else, contentment maybe. It had been so long since the room had felt alive like this. They ate breakfast together, Clara keeping up a steady stream of chatter about her dreams, about the snow, about how Elena had braided her hair just like Mama used to. Elena listened with the kind of attention that children craved, asking questions, laughing at Clara's jokes, treating each small observation like it was the most important thing in the world. Jacob watched this interplay with growing wonder. Elena moved through his kitchen like she belonged there, knowing instinctively where things were kept, anticipating Clara's needs before the child even voiced them. When Clara spilled syrup on her nightgown, Elena had her cleaned and changed with such natural efficiency that it took Jacob's breath away. "You're good with children," he observed as Elena helped Clara into her boots and winter coat. Something flickered across Elena's face, pain maybe, or longing. It feels familiar, like muscle memory. Maybe you were a governess or a teacher." Elena shook her head slowly. "I don't think so. This feels deeper than that, more personal." She paused, watching Clara struggle with her coat buttons. "Jacob, what if I had children of my own? What if there's someone out there looking for me, wondering where I am?" The thought had occurred to him too during the long hours he'd spent watching over them both, but he'd pushed it aside, unwilling to examine the implications too closely. "Then they'll find you when they find you," he said simply. "Until then, Clara needs what you're giving her, and maybe you need it too." Elena's hands stilled on Clara's coat. "I shouldn't stay. Every day I'm here puts you both at risk. Those men who were looking for someone matching my description, what if they come back?" "What men?" Jacob's voice sharpened. Elena hesitated, then seemed to come to some internal decision. 3 days before the storm hit, I was in Millerville getting supplies. A woman at the general store warned me that strangers had been asking questions, men with hard faces and harder eyes. They were looking for a woman, mid-20s, dark hair, traveling alone. They said she was dangerous. Jacob felt ice form on his stomach. What kind of dangerous? The kind that involves wanted posters and rewards. Elena's voice was barely above a whisper. "Jacob, what if I really am what they say? What if I've done something terrible and just can't remember?" Before Jacob could respond, Clara tugged on Elena's skirt. "Can we build a snow fort? Please, Papa promised we could when the storm stopped." Elena looked down at the child's eager face, then up at Jacob's concerned one. He could see the war playing out in her green eyes, the desire to stay warring with the fear of what her presence might cost them. "One fort," Jacob said decisively. "Then we talk." They spent the morning in the snow, Clara directing their architectural efforts with the serious intensity of a general planning a siege. Elena threw herself into the project with enthusiasm that seemed forced at first, but gradually became genuine. She showed Clara how to pack the snow just right, how to create windows and battlements, how to make snowballs that wouldn't crumble in flight. Jacob found himself stealing glances at her as they worked. In the bright sunlight, he could see details he'd missed in the firelight, the delicate bone structure of her hands, the way she moved with unconscious grace, the small scar at the base of her throat that looked suspiciously like a bullet wound. But he also saw the way she laughed when Clara pelted her with a snowball, the way her whole face lit up when his daughter smiled, the protective instinct that made her place herself between Clara and any perceived danger, even something as harmless as an icicle falling from the eaves. "She doesn't act like a criminal," he murmured to himself as Elena helped Clara add the finishing touches to their fortress. "Papa, come see," Clara called, grabbing his hand and pulling him toward their creation. "Elena showed me how to make it strong so it won't fall down." The fort was impressive solid walls, strategic viewing ports, and a flag made from one of Margaret's old dish towels flying proudly from the highest point. But what caught Jacob's attention was the way Elena had positioned it with clear sightlines to all approaches, and the house at its back. It was the kind of tactical thinking that came from experience, the kind that soldiers learned in wartime. "You've built fortifications before," he said quietly to Elena, as Clara played inside their creation. Elena frowned, pressing a hand to her temple. Maybe. It felt natural, like I knew exactly what to do." She looked up at him with troubled eyes. "That's what scares me, Jacob. These glimpses of knowledge I can't explain. What if they're memories of things I don't want to remember?" Their conversation was interrupted by the sound of hoofbeats crunching through snow. Jacob's hand instinctively moved toward the rifle he'd propped against a fence post, but the tension eased when he recognized the rider. "Tom Brennan," he called out to the approaching figure. "What brings you out in this weather?" Tom Brennan was Jacob's nearest neighbor, a grizzled old-timer whose ranch lay 5 miles to the east. He was also the closest thing to law enforcement in this part of the territory, serving as an unofficial deputy when needed. His weathered face was grim as he reined in his horse. "Jacob." Tom nodded, then his eyes found Elena. His expression didn't change, but Jacob caught the way his hand shifted slightly toward the gun at his hip. "Heard you might have had a visitor during the storm." "News travels fast," Jacob said carefully. "Fast enough." Tom's gaze never left Elena, who had gone very still beside the snow fort. "Mind if I have a word?" Jacob felt Clara press against his leg, sensing the sudden tension in the air. Elena's face had gone pale, but she stepped forward with quiet dignity. "If you have questions about me, you can ask them directly," she said, her voice steady despite the fear Jacob could see in her eyes. Tom studied her for a long moment. "Fair enough. I'm Tom Brennan. Got word from Sheriff Morrison in Millerville that some federal marshals came through asking questions. They're looking for a woman. Description matches you pretty close." "What are the charges?" Elena asked quietly. "Murder," Tom said bluntly. "Bank robbery, treason against the United States government." The words hit like physical blows. Jacob felt Clara shrink against him, confused by the adult conversation, but frightened by its tone. Elena swayed slightly as if the accusations had knocked the wind out of her. I don't," she started, then stopped, pressing both hands to her temples. "I can't remember. God help me, I can't remember anything." "That's convenient," Tom said, but his tone was more curious than accusatory. "No," Elena said sharply, looking up with blazing eyes. "It's not convenient. It's terrifying. Do you know what it's like to wake up not knowing who you are, what you've done, whether the blood on your clothes is your own or someone else's? Do you know what it's like to wonder if you're a monster and just can't remember being one?" The raw pain in her voice seemed to catch Tom off guard. He glanced at Jacob, then back at Elena. "The marshals left descriptions," he said more gently. "Woman thereafter has a distinctive scar on her left shoulder, knife wound fairly recent." Without hesitation, Elena pushed back the sleeve of her borrowed dress. Her left shoulder was unmarked except for a small birthmark shaped like a crescent moon. Tom nodded slowly. "Different woman, then. Though you do favor her in looks." Jacob felt relief wash over him so powerfully it made his knees weak. But Elena didn't look relieved. She looked lost. "Then who am I?" she whispered. "If I'm not this woman they're looking for, who am I really?" "That's something you'll have to figure out for yourself," Tom said kindly. "But it might be wise to steer clear of Millerville for a while, just until the marshals move on." After Tom left, they spent the rest of the day in subdued quiet. Clara seemed to sense the change in mood and stayed close to Elena, offering small gifts: a pretty rock, a handful of snow shaped like a flower, a drawing made with charcoal on a piece of bark. Elena accepted each offering with gratitude that seemed to go bone deep. That evening, after Clara was tucked into bed with a story and a lullaby sung in Elena's clear, sweet voice, Jacob and Elena sat by the fire with cups of coffee growing cold between them. "I should leave," Elena said quietly. "I've brought enough trouble to your door." "Have you?" Jacob asked. "Because from where I sit, you've brought more peace to this house than it's seen in 2 years." Elena shook her head. You don't understand. Even if I'm not the woman the marshals are looking for, I'm still someone. Someone with a past that involves bullet scars and tactical knowledge and children's lullabies I can't place. What if that past catches up with us? Jacob was quiet for a long moment, staring into the dancing flames. Elena, can I ask you something? Of course. When you look at Clara, what do you feel? Elena's eyes softened. Love, she said without hesitation. Protection. Like I would die before I let anything hurt her. She paused. Like she's mine, even though I know she isn't. And when she calls you mama, like coming home to a place I've never been, but always belonged. Elena's voice broke slightly. It doesn't make sense, Jacob. None of this makes sense. Jacob leaned forward, his eyes intense. What if it doesn't have to make sense? What if some things just are? You're willing to risk everything on a feeling, on instinct. I'm willing to risk everything on what I see with my own eyes, Jacob said firmly. I see a woman who holds my daughter like she's precious china. I see someone who works from dawn to dusk without being asked, who brings laughter back to a house that had forgotten the sound. I see someone who would put herself between Clara and danger without a second thought. But what if the sky falls down? Jacob interrupted gently. What if the world ends tomorrow? Elena, I spent 2 years asking what if about everything. What if I'd been a better husband? What if I'd seen the fever coming sooner? What if I'd prayed harder, fought harder, loved harder? It near about drove me mad. He reached across the space between them and took her hands in his. They were work-roughened now, no longer the soft hands of whatever life she'd lived before, but they were warm and real and trembling slightly in his grasp. Then you walked through that door, he continued, and my daughter spoke for the first time in months. She laughed. She played. She slept through the night without nightmares. Whatever you were before, whoever you might have been right now today, you're the answer to prayers I didn't even know how to pray. Elena's eyes filled with tears. What if I disappoint you? What if I'm not who you think I am? Then we'll figure it out together, Jacob said simply. But Elena, I've been watching you for a week now. I've seen how you gentle the horses, how you split wood without being asked, how you darn Clara's stockings by lamplight, when you think no one's looking. I've seen you give her the last biscuit and pretend you're not hungry. I've seen you check the locks twice every night to make sure we're safe. Anyone would do those things. No, Jacob said firmly. They wouldn't. Those are the actions of someone with a good heart. Someone who puts others before herself. Someone worth trusting, worth keeping, worth. He stopped, realizing how close he was to saying words that would change everything between them. Worth what? Elena whispered. Jacob looked into her eyes, those pale green eyes that had haunted his dreams, and made another decision that surprised him. Worth loving, he said quietly. The words hung between them like a bridge. Neither was sure they were ready to cross. Elena's breath caught, and for a moment Jacob thought she might pull away. Instead, she moved closer. Jacob, I can't promise you anything. I don't even know what promises I might have made to other people in other lives. I'm not asking for promises, Jacob said. I'm asking for today, for tomorrow, for as long as you're willing to stay. Elena was quiet for so long that Jacob began to think he'd pushed too hard, revealed too much. Then she spoke so softly he almost missed it. I dream about a little girl sometimes. Not Clara, someone else. She has dark hair and she's crying, calling for her mama. Elena's voice grew strained. What if she was mine? What if I left her somewhere, abandoned her when I ran? Do you really believe that? Jacob asked gently. Elena closed her eyes, concentrating. In the dream, I'm trying to get to her. Someone's holding me back, but I'm fighting to reach her. She's scared and I'm desperate to help her, but I can't. She opened her eyes, meeting Jacob's gaze. It doesn't feel like abandonment. It feels like separation, like someone took me away from her against my will. Then maybe that's your answer, Jacob said. Maybe you're not running from something bad you did. Maybe you're running from something bad that was done to you. The possibility seemed to settle something in Elena's expression. I wish I could remember. I wish I knew for certain. Memory might come back in time, but Elena, even if it doesn't, even if you never remember who you were before, you can choose who you want to be now. And who do you think I should be? Jacob smiled, the first real smile he'd worn since Margaret's death. Exactly who you already are, Clara's mama, he paused, suddenly uncertain, my partner, my friend, my hope for something better than I thought possible. Elena studied his face in the firelight, and Jacob could see her weighing possibilities, calculating risks, fighting the battle between fear and hope that he knew all too well. One day at a time, she asked finally. One day at a time, Jacob agreed. They sat in comfortable silence after that, watching the fire burn down to embers. Outside, the wind had picked up again, not with the fury of the storm, but with the steady persistence of winter settling in for a long stay. Jacob found himself hoping it would last forever, this peace, this warmth, this feeling that his family might be complete again. Jacob, Elena's voice was drowsy, her head resting against the back of her chair. Thank you for not turning me away, for letting me stay even when it doesn't make sense. Thank you, he replied, for giving me back my daughter's laughter. As Elena made her way upstairs to the bedroom that had once been Margaret's but was slowly becoming hers, Jacob remained by the dying fire. He thought about the choices he'd made, the risks he'd taken, the way his heart had started beating again after 2 years of just going through the motions. Tomorrow there would be work to do, animals to feed, wood to split, preparations to make for the long winter ahead. There would be questions to answer, both from neighbors and from Elena herself, as her memory slowly returned. There would be challenges and complications, and probably more than a few moments of doubt. But tonight, his daughter was sleeping peacefully upstairs, protected by a woman who loved her for reasons neither of them fully understood. Tonight, his house felt like a home again. Tonight, the future looked like something more than just surviving until spring. And if that wasn't worth a few risks, Jacob Renfield didn't know what was. The fire settled into ash and ember, but the warmth in the house, the warmth of family, of belonging, of hope reborn, would last much longer than any winter storm. The weeks that followed brought a rhythm to their lives that felt as natural as breathing. Elena rose before dawn each morning, starting the fire and preparing breakfast with quiet efficiency that spoke of ingrained habit. Clara would appear shortly after, drawn by the smell of coffee and the soft humming that had become Elena's unconscious morning ritual. Jacob would find them together at the kitchen table, Clara chattering about her dreams, while Elena listened with the kind of attention that made even the smallest observations feel important. But it was during the quiet moments between daily tasks that Jacob began to notice the cracks in Elena's carefully constructed composure. He'd catch her staring out the window with an expression of such profound sadness that it made his chest ache. Sometimes she'd stop mid-sentence, her hand flying to her temple as if trying to grasp a memory that danced just beyond reach. And at night, when she thought everyone was asleep, he could hear her pacing the floor above, wrestling with demons she couldn't name. The breakthrough came on a Tuesday morning in late November, 3 weeks after the storm had brought Elena into their lives. Clara had been playing with her corn husk doll in the parlor, while Elena mended one of Jacob's shirts by the window. The scene was so peaceful, so perfectly domestic, that Jacob almost missed the moment everything changed. Elena's needle stopped mid-stitch, her entire body going rigid as she stared at something only she could see. The shirt slipped from her nerveless fingers as her breathing became rapid and shallow. "Elena," Jacob said softly, not wanting to startle her. She didn't respond. Her eyes were fixed on some distant point, her face pale as winter snow. Then, without warning, she gasped and doubled over as if someone had struck her. "No," she whispered, her voice breaking. "Please, no, I have to get to her. Let me go, she needs me." Clara looked up from her doll, Her young face creased with concern. "Mama, what's wrong?" The word seemed to anchor Elena back to the present. She blinked rapidly, looking around the parlor with confusion, before her gaze settled on Clara's worried face. I remembered something," Elena said shakily. "There was a little girl. She was crying, calling for help, and I couldn't reach her. Someone was holding me back, dragging me away." Her voice grew stronger, more certain. Her name was Sarah. Sarah with the dark curls and the blue dress with tiny flowers. Jacob knelt beside Elena's chair, taking her trembling hands in his steady ones. "Your daughter?" "I don't know," Elena said, frustration creeping into her voice. "It doesn't feel like... The love is there, but it's different. Protective, but not maternal. More like..." She paused, searching for words. "Like a sister's love, or a caretaker's." "Could you have been a governess?" Jacob suggested gently. Elena shook her head slowly. "No, it was more personal than that. I knew her routines, her fears, her favorite songs. I knew that she hated carrots but would eat them if you mixed them with enough butter. I knew that she needed her bedroom door left open just a crack because complete darkness scared her." Clara had abandoned her doll and come to stand beside Elena's chair, pressing close with the instinctive comfort children offered to wounded adults. Elena's arms came around her automatically, and Jacob saw the exact moment when another piece of memory clicked into place. "Oh," Elena breathed, her eyes widening. "Oh, I remember now. I was her nursemaid, Sarah Langston, daughter of Colonel William Langston. She was 7 years old, and she was..." Elena's voice caught. "She was everything good and innocent in a world gone mad with war." "The war," Jacob prompted gently. Elena nodded, her eyes growing distant again. 1864, Virginia. The colonel was Union Army stationed at a forward position near Richmond. His wife had died the year before, and he couldn't bear to send Sarah back east to relatives. So she stayed with the regiment, and I was hired to care for her. What happened to her? The question seemed to break something inside Elena. Tears began streaming down her cheeks as the full weight of recovered memory crashed over her. "Confederate raiders," she whispered. "They came in the night looking for intelligence, for anything they could use. The colonel was away on reconnaissance, and we were supposed to be safe behind Union lines, but..." She shuddered. "They found us anyway." Clara tightened her arms around Elena, somehow understanding that this was a story of loss and pain. Jacob waited, knowing that Elena needed to tell this tale in her own time, in her own way. "I woke to the sound of gunfire," Elena continued, her voice growing stronger with each word. "My first thought was Sarah. I ran to her room, but they were already there. 3 men in gray uniforms ransacking the colonel's quarters looking for documents. Sarah was huddled in her bed, terrified, calling for me." Elena's hand unconsciously moved to the faded scar at her throat. "I tried to get to her, but one of them grabbed me. When I fought, he put a gun to my throat and told me to be still or watch the child die. So I was still while they tore apart everything the colonel held dear, while they terrified a little girl who had already lost her mother." "But you survived," Jacob said quietly. "You're here." "The colonel returned while they were still searching," Elena said. "There was fighting. In the confusion, I broke free and ran to Sarah, but..." Her voice cracked. "One of the raiders, a young man not much older than a boy himself, was backing toward the window with an armload of papers. Sarah was between him and his escape route, and he was scared, panicking. He raised his gun toward her, and I..." Elena couldn't finish the sentence, but Jacob could see the rest of the story in her haunted eyes. "You got between them," he said. Elena nodded. "The bullet was meant for her, but I made sure it found me instead. It creased my throat, knocked me unconscious. When I woke up 3 days later, the regiment was gone. Everyone was gone. Sarah, the colonel, everyone I knew. I was in a field hospital 30 miles away, and no one could tell me what had happened to the little girl I'd failed to protect." The parlor fell silent except for the crackling of logs in the fireplace. Clara had gone very still, in Elena's embrace, processing this adult story of war and loss with the solemn attention children reserved for truly important things. "You didn't fail," Jacob said firmly. "You took a bullet for her. You did everything you could." "But was it enough?" Elena asked, anguish clear in her voice. "Jacob, I've been having nightmares for weeks, dreams of a little girl crying for help while I stood paralyzed, unable to move. What if she died because I wasn't strong enough? What if she needed me and I failed her?" Before Jacob could respond, Clara spoke up in her clear, sweet voice. "She didn't die," Clara said with absolute certainty. Both adults looked down at her in surprise. Clara's blue eyes were serious, older than her years, as if she was channeling some wisdom beyond her young understanding. "How do you know, sweetheart?" Elena asked gently. Clara touched Elena's cheek with one small hand. "Because you're here taking care of me now. The angels wouldn't send a broken person to be my mama. They'd send someone who knows how to save little girls." The simple faith in Clara's words hit Elena like a physical blow. She buried her face against the child's shoulder and wept for Sarah Langston, for the war that had stolen so many innocents, for the months of not knowing who she was or what she'd done. Jacob watched this outpouring of grief and healing with a mixture of relief and growing understanding. The tactical knowledge, the way Elena instinctively positioned herself between Clara and any potential threat, the maternal instincts that seemed to come from experience, it all made sense now. Elena wasn't just a woman who'd lost her memory. She was a woman who'd spent years protecting children in a world gone mad with violence. "Elena," he said quietly, waiting until she looked up at him through her tears. "You said your name was Elena Marlowe, but that's not your real name, is it?" Elena wiped her eyes with the back of her hand. "No, my real name is Elena Vasquez. I was born in New Mexico territory before it was even a territory. My father was Mexican, my mother was a settler from Missouri. When they died of cholera, I was 15 and completely alone." "How did you end up caring for Sarah?" "I worked my way east, taking whatever jobs I could find. Seamstress, cook, laundress, anything respectable for a young woman on her own. When the war started, I was working for a family in Philadelphia. Their eldest son was Colonel Langston's aide-de-camp. When the colonel needed a nursemaid for Sarah, someone who could handle the hardships of following an army, they recommended me." Elena's voice grew softer, more reflective. "Those 3 years with Sarah were the happiest of my life. She was such a bright, curious child. She spoke 3 languages by the time she was 6, could recite poetry from memory, and had opinions about everything from military strategy to the proper way to prepare coffee." "You loved her," Jacob observed. "Like she was my own daughter," Elena confirmed. "More than that, she was my purpose. In all that chaos and death and madness, keeping her safe and happy was the one thing that made sense." Clara had been listening with rapt attention throughout this exchange. Now she looked up at Elena with the serious expression she wore when working through complicated adult concepts. "Is that why you take such good care of me?" Clara asked. "Because you practiced with Sarah?" Elena's smile was watery but genuine. "Maybe little bird, or maybe it's because taking care of little girls is what my heart knows how to do. Even if you can't remember everything, especially then," Elena said, pressing a kiss to the top of Clara's head. "Some kinds of love are too deep for forgetting." Jacob felt something settle into place in his chest, a rightness, a certainty that had been building for weeks. This woman who'd stumbled into their lives wasn't just a convenient solution to his loneliness or Clara's need for maternal care. She was someone whose entire identity had been built around protecting innocence. Someone whose first instinct was always to shield others from harm, even at the cost of her own safety. "What happened after you woke up in that field hospital?" he asked. Elena's expression grew troubled again. "The doctors said I had a severe concussion, along with the bullet wound. My memories were scrambled. I knew my name was Elena, but I couldn't remember where I'd come from or why I was there. They said I kept asking for Sarah, but they didn't know who I meant." She stood up, moving to the window to stare out at the snow-covered landscape. I spent months trying to piece together what had happened, following leads that went nowhere, asking questions no one could answer. The Army had no record of a Sarah Langston. Colonel Langston had been transferred to another theater of war, his whereabouts classified. It was like she'd never existed. "So you came west," Jacob said. "I came west," Elena agreed. "I thought maybe in a new place, away from all the reminders, I could build a different life. I worked as a seamstress in Denver for almost 2 years, trying to forget, but the nightmares never stopped. The guilt never stopped. And then 3 weeks ago, something happened that brought it all rushing back." She turned from the window, meeting Jacob's eyes with an intensity that made his breath catch. "I was walking past the schoolhouse in Denver when I heard a little girl crying. She couldn't have been more than 6, and she was lost, separated from her mother in the crowd. When I knelt down to help her, she looked at me with these enormous brown eyes and said, 'Are you my angel?' Mama said angels help little girls who are scared." Elena's voice grew thick with emotion. In that moment, everything came flooding back Sarah's face. The sound of gunfire, the feel of that bullet burning across my throat. But more than that, I remembered why I'd survived. Not to forget, not to start over, but to keep doing what I'd always done, to protect children who needed protecting. "What happened to the little girl?" Clara asked. "I found her mother," Elena said with a small smile. "Reunited them safely, but the experience shook me so badly that I knew I couldn't stay in Denver anymore. I had to keep moving, had to find some place where the memories couldn't follow me." "But they followed you anyway," Jacob said gently. "They followed me anyway," Elena agreed. "Right up until I collapsed on your doorstep, half dead and completely broken. I thought I was running away from my past. I didn't realize I was running toward my future." The three of them stood in comfortable silence for a moment, processing the weight of these revelations. Outside, snow had begun to fall again, not the fierce blizzard that had brought Elena to them, but the gentle, steady snowfall of winter settling in for the long haul. "Elena," Jacob said finally, "there's something I need to tell you too." She turned to face him, fully concerned, creasing her brow at the serious tone in his voice. "I've been getting letters," he said, "from town, from neighbors, even from Denver. Word has spread about you being here, and people are curious. Some are supportive, but others—" He paused, choosing his words carefully. "Others think a single woman living with a widower and his child is improper, scandalous even." Elena's face went pale. "Jacob, I never meant to damage your reputation. If people are talking, if it's causing problems for you and Clara—" "I don't give a damn what people say about me," Jacob interrupted firmly. "But I do care about Clara, and I care about you. If the gossip gets bad enough, it could affect Clara when she starts school, and it could make life difficult for you if you ever want to work in town, or—" He trailed off, suddenly uncertain about what he was trying to say. Elena watched him struggle with patient understanding, waiting for him to find his words. "What I'm trying to say," Jacob continued finally, "is that there might be a way to solve both problems, a way to make sure no one can question your place here, your right to be Clara's mother figure, your—" "Jacob," Elena said softly, "what are you asking me?" Clara had been following this adult conversation with the focused attention she gave to everything important. Now she piped up with the directness that only children possessed. "Papa wants to know if you'll marry him," she announced matter-of-factly, "so you can be my real mama, instead of just my pretend mama." Both adults stared at Clara in shock, then at each other. Elena's cheeks flushed red while Jacob cleared his throat awkwardly. "Clara, sweetheart, it's more complicated than," Jacob began. "No, it's not," Clara interrupted with 5-year-old logic. "You love Elena. Elena loves you. I love both of you. And I want Elena to stay forever and ever, so you should get married like grown-ups do when they want to be a family." Elena sank back into her chair, looking stunned. "Clara, honey, marriage is a big step. It's not something people do just because it's convenient or proper. But you do love Papa, don't you? Clara asked with devastating innocence. The question hung in the air like smoke from the fireplace. Elena looked at Jacob, her green eyes wide and vulnerable, and he could see her wrestling with truth and fear in equal measure. Elena started, then stopped. She took a deep breath and tried again. Yes, Clara, I do love your Papa, but love isn't always enough. Sometimes there are complications, things that make it difficult for people to be together even when they want to be. What kind of complications? Clara demanded. Elena glanced at Jacob seeking help, but he was watching her with an intensity that made her heart race. She could see in his dark eyes that he was waiting for her answer as eagerly as Clara was. Well, Elena said carefully, sometimes people have secrets or pasts that might catch up with them. Sometimes they're not sure they deserve the love that's being offered. Clara considered this with the serious attention she gave to all adult mysteries. Then she climbed into Elena's lap and cupped her face with small, warm hands. Elena, Clara said solemnly, do you remember when you told me that some kinds of love are too deep for forgetting? Yes, sweetheart. Well, Papa's love for you is like that, and my love for you is like that too. Even if you had 1,000,000 secrets or 1,000 bad things in your past, we'd still love you, because that's what families do. Elena's eyes filled with tears again, but these were different tears, not the bitter salt of grief and regret, but the sweet release of hope finally allowed to bloom. And besides, Clara continued with devastating 5-year-old logic, if you marry Papa, then you'll really truly be my mama forever. Even if someone tries to take you away again, you'll belong to us and we'll belong to you, and nobody can change that. The wisdom in those words, spoken by a child who had already lost one mother and lived in daily fear of losing another, broke through Elena's last reserves of caution. She looked at Jacob over Clara's head and saw in his face the same hope, the same desperate desire for permanence that she felt in her own heart. Jacob, she said quietly, are you sure, even knowing everything you know now about who I am, what I've been through? Jacob crossed the room and knelt beside Elena's chair, taking both her hands and Clara's in his larger ones. Elena Vasquez, he said formally, I'm asking you to marry me not despite who you are, but because of who you are. Because you're a woman who would take a bullet for a child she wasn't even related to. Because you're someone who spent 3 years keeping a little girl safe in the middle of a war. Because you're the person who brought laughter back to this house and gave my daughter the courage to trust again. Elena's breath caught. Jacob, I'm not finished, he said gently. I'm asking you to marry me because when I see you with Clara, I see the future I thought I'd lost when Margaret died. I'm asking you because I love the way you sing while you work, the way you check the locks every night to keep us safe, the way you give Clara the last piece of cornbread and pretend you're not hungry. He paused, his voice growing thick with emotion. But mostly I'm asking you to marry me because I can't imagine our lives without you in them. And if that's selfish, if that's asking too much given everything you've been through— Yes, Elena interrupted, her voice barely above a whisper. Yes, Jacob repeated, hardly daring to believe what he'd heard. Yes, I'll marry you, Elena said more firmly. Yes to being Clara's mother. Yes to being your wife. Yes to building a future together, whatever that might bring. Clara let out a whoop of joy that could probably be heard in 3 counties. She threw her arms around both adults, squeezing with all her 5-year-old strength. We're going to be a real family, she declared. A real, true, forever family. But even as Jacob pulled both his girls into his arms, even as Elena finally allowed herself to believe in happy endings, none of them noticed the lone rider watching the house from the ridgeline above the ranch. They didn't see him turn his horse and disappear into the gathering snow, carrying news of the woman who lived with Jacob Renfield back to the men who had been searching for her since that bloody night in Virginia 14 years ago. The past, it seemed, had finally found Elena Vasquez. And it was coming for her with the relentless patience of men who never forgot a debt unpaid. But for now, in the warm glow of the parlor fire, with Clara's excited chatter filling the air and Jacob's strong arms around her, Elena allowed herself to believe that love might be stronger than memory, that hope might triumph over fear, and that some storms, even the ones that had been building for years, could finally find their end in the simple act of three broken hearts choosing to heal together. The die, as they say, had been cast. Whatever came next would find them facing it, not as strangers thrown together by chance, but as a family bound by choice, commitment, and love that had been tested by separation and strengthened by reunion. And if that wasn't worth fighting for, nothing in this world ever would be. The wedding was planned for Christmas Eve, just 6 weeks away, and the preparations brought a joy to the Double R ranch that Jacob had thought was gone forever. Elena threw herself into the details with an enthusiasm that spoke of dreams long deferred, while Clara appointed herself chief wedding planner and took her duties with the utmost seriousness. "Mama needs a dress as pretty as an angel," Clara announced one morning over breakfast, using the word mama now with the casual confidence of a child whose world had finally made sense again. "And flowers, even if they're frozen, and a cake as tall as me." Elena laughed, the sound bright and clear in the warm kitchen. "Sweetheart, it's winter. We'll have to make do with whatever we can find. Then we'll make it beautiful ourselves," Jacob said, reaching across the table to squeeze Elena's hand. "Tom Brennan's wife Sarah knows how to work miracles with a sewing machine, and Mrs. Henderson at the general store has been saving her good lace for something special." The mention of Tom Brennan made Elena pause her fork halfway to her mouth. "Jacob, are you sure about having people here, about making this so public?" Jacob understood her concern. In the weeks since their engagement, the gossip had intensified rather than died down. Some neighbors were genuinely happy for them, but others whispered about the mysterious woman who'd appeared from nowhere and captured the heart of one of the territory's most eligible widowers. "Elena," Jacob said gently, "we could ride to Denver and have a quiet ceremony if you'd prefer, but I want the world to know you're my wife. I want Clara to have the wedding she's dreaming of, and I want anyone with doubts about your place here to see that you belong to us and we belong to you." Elena nodded slowly, but Jacob could see the worry lingering in her green eyes. She'd been having more dreams lately, not the clear memories of Sarah Langston, but fragmented images of men with hard faces, urgent whispers about someone who knew too much, and the constant feeling of being hunted. "What if someone recognizes me?" she asked quietly when Clara was distracted by her corn-husked doll. "What if my past catches up with us at the worst possible moment?" "Then we'll face it together," Jacob said firmly. "Elena, you're not the same woman you were 14 years ago. Whatever those men were looking for, whoever they thought you were, that person is gone. You're Elena Renfield now, or you will be. You're Clara's mother and my wife, and I'll be damned if I let anyone take that away from us." But even as he spoke the words with conviction, Jacob couldn't shake the feeling that they were being watched. Twice in the past week he'd caught glimpses of movement on the ridge above the ranch shadows that disappeared when he looked directly at them. His old soldier's instincts were screaming warnings, but he'd found no concrete evidence of danger, no tracks in the snow, no strangers asking questions in town. Still, he'd taken to carrying his rifle more often, and he'd made sure Elena knew where he kept the loaded shotgun behind the kitchen door. The first real sign of trouble came 3 days before the wedding, when Reverend Matthews rode out from town with a face as grim as a funeral director. "Jacob," the Reverend said without preamble, "we need to talk, privately." Elena was in the barn feeding the horses, and Clara was napping after a morning spent helping her mother-to-be string cranberries for wedding decorations. Jacob led the Reverend into the parlor and closed the door firmly. What's this about Reverend Matthews was a good man, Jacob knew, but he was also a man who cared deeply about his reputation and the reputation of his church. He shifted uncomfortably in his chair before speaking. "Jacob, I've been hearing things, disturbing things about Miss Vasquez, such as federal agents asking questions in Denver about a woman matching her description, such as wanted posters that bear more than a passing resemblance to your intended bride." Jacob's blood went cold, but he kept his voice steady. "What kind of wanted posters? The kind that mention treason, Jacob? The kind that carry rewards large enough to make honest men consider doing dishonest things?" Matthews pulled a folded paper from his coat pocket and handed it to Jacob with obvious reluctance. The poster was old, worn from handling, but the face sketched in black ink was unmistakably Elena's, though younger, harder, with eyes that held no trace of the gentle warmth Jacob had come to love. "Wanted for questioning in connection with the murder of Confederate Colonel James Morrison and the theft of classified military documents." Jacob read aloud. "Elena Catherine Vasquez, also known as Elena Marlowe, also known as the Sparrow. Reward $5,000. The amount took Jacob's breath away. $5,000 was more money than most men saw in a lifetime. "Jacob," Matthews said gently, "I've known you since you first came to this territory. You're a good man, and I believe you when you say you love this woman. But you have to understand, if these agents find her here, if they take her into custody on your wedding day, she's not guilty of whatever they think she did," Jacob said firmly, though his hands were shaking as he refolded the poster. "How can you be so certain?" Jacob thought of Elena's gentle hands braiding Clara's hair, of the way she'd cried when she remembered failing to save Sarah Langston, of the absolute terror in her eyes when she'd first asked if she might be dangerous. "Because I've seen who she really is," Jacob said simply. "Whatever happened during the war, whatever role she played, she was protecting children, not murdering colonels." Matthew sighed heavily. "Jacob, I want to believe that. But performing a marriage ceremony for a woman wanted by federal authorities, it could destroy my ministry, my church, everything I've worked for." The words hit Jacob like physical blows. Without the Reverend's blessing, there could be no proper wedding, no legal recognition of Elena as his wife, no protection for Clara if something happened to him. "Reverend, please," Jacob began, but Matthews held up a hand. "There might be a way," the older man said slowly. "If Miss Vasquez were to turn herself in, cooperate with the authorities, clear her name properly, then I could perform the ceremony with a clear conscience. And if they arrest her, if they decide she's guilty regardless of the truth, then at least you'd know you did the right thing." Jacob stared at the wanted poster studying Elena's younger face with new eyes. The woman in the sketch looked capable of anything dangerous, determined utterly without mercy. But the woman upstairs, the woman who sang lullabies to his daughter and checked the locks twice each night to keep them safe, that woman was incapable of murder. Wasn't she? The doubt once planted began to grow like poison in Jacob's mind. What did he really know about Elena's war years? What if her memories were returning selectively, showing him only what she wanted him to see? What if the gentle nursemaid persona was just another role like the aliases listed on the wanted poster? He was still wrestling with these dark thoughts when Elena appeared in the doorway, her face pale and stricken. She must have come in from the barn and overheard the conversation through the thin parlor walls. "Elena," Jacob started, but she cut him off with a gesture. "May I see it, please?" she asked quietly. Jacob hesitated, then handed her the poster. Elena studied her own face with the detached interest of someone examining a stranger. "The Sparrow," she murmured. "I remember that name now. It was my code name." "Your what?" Matthews asked sharply. Elena looked up, meeting the Reverend's suspicious gaze with calm dignity. "My code name when I carried messages for the Union Army. I was small, fast, and forgettable, perfect for slipping through enemy lines with intelligence." "You were a spy." Jacob's voice was barely above a whisper. I was a courier, Elena corrected. There's a difference. Spies gather information. I simply carried it from one place to another. Matthews leaned forward in his chair. And Colonel Morrison, Elena's composure cracked slightly. I remember him now. Confederate intelligence officer who discovered that Sarah Langston's father was feeding information to Union forces. Morrison came to the camp looking for evidence documents that would prove the colonel's treason. Did you kill him? Jacob asked bluntly. Elena met his eyes without flinching. I don't know. I remember fighting him when he threatened Sarah. I remember the sound of a gunshot, but whether the bullet came from my gun or someone else's. She shrugged helplessly. That part is still blank. The admission hung in the room like smoke from a dying fire. Matthews looked vindicated, as if Elena's uncertainty proved his worst suspicions. Jacob felt his world tilting on its axis once again. Elena, he said carefully, if you're not sure, I'm sure of this. Elena interrupted, her voice growing stronger. I'm sure that whatever I did to protect a 7-year-old girl from men who would have used her as leverage against her father. I'm sure that if Colonel Morrison died by my hand, it was because he was threatening an innocent child. But you can't be certain, Matthews pressed. No, Elena admitted. I can't be certain of anything that happened that night. But I am certain of who I am now, who I choose to be. And I won't let the ghosts of a war I barely remember destroy the family I've found. Clara's voice drifted from upstairs calling for her mama, and Elena's entire demeanor softened at the sound. I should go to her, Elena said. She'll be frightened if she wakes alone. As Elena's footsteps faded up the stairs, Matthews turned to Jacob with pity in his eyes. I'm sorry, my friend, but I can't perform this ceremony, not with so many questions unanswered. After the Reverend left, Jacob sat alone in his parlor as darkness fell around him. The wanted poster lay on the table like an accusation, Elena's young face staring up at him, with eyes that held secrets he was no longer sure he wanted to know. When Elena finally came downstairs after putting Clara to bed, she moved like a woman walking to her own execution. You have questions, she said, simply settling into the chair across from him. I have doubts, Jacob admitted, and I hate myself for it. Elena nodded as if she'd expected this. What do you need to know? Did you kill Colonel Morrison? I honestly don't remember, but Jacob, if I pulled that trigger to save Sarah Langston's life, would that change how you feel about me? The question cut to the heart of everything Jacob believed about justice, about right and wrong, about the woman he'd fallen in love with. I don't know, he said quietly. Elena's smile was sad but understanding. That's an honest answer, more honest than I probably deserve. Elena, No, let me say this, Elena interrupted. I've been living in a fool's paradise thinking the past would stay buried, but it won't, will it? It's going to keep following me, keep threatening the people I love. Maybe it's time I stopped running. What are you saying? I'm saying maybe Reverend Matthews is right. Maybe I should turn myself in, face whatever charges they want to bring, clear my name properly. Jacob felt panic rise in his chest. And if they convict you, if they decide you're guilty whether you remember or not, then Clara will be safe from whatever danger I represent, and you'll be free to find someone whose past won't put your family at risk. The words hit Jacob like a slap. He was on his feet before he realized he'd moved, crossing to Elena's chair and dropping to his knees beside it. Elena, look at me, he said urgently. Whatever you did or didn't do 14 years ago doesn't change who you are now. It doesn't change what you mean to Clara, what you mean to me. Doesn't it? Elena asked softly. Jacob, you have doubts. I can see them in your eyes. How can you marry a woman you're not sure you trust? Because trust isn't about certainty, Jacob said fiercely. It's about choosing to believe in someone despite the unknowns. Elena, I've watched you with Clara for months now. I've seen how you gentle, frightened horses, how you give away your last bite of food to make sure we're fed, how you lie awake at night listening for sounds that might threaten our safety. That's not the behavior of a cold-blooded killer." Elena's eyes filled with tears. "But what if you're wrong? What if the woman you love is just an illusion, and the real Elena Vasquez is the dangerous creature on that wanted poster?" "Then I'll love the illusion," Jacob said simply, "because the illusion raised my daughter from despair, brought laughter back to this house, and gave me a reason to hope again." They were interrupted by the sound of horses approaching the house, multiple riders moving fast through the snow. Jacob's blood turned to ice as he counted hoofbeats. At least 6 horses, maybe more. "Elena, get upstairs," he said quietly, reaching for his rifle. "Get Clara and lock yourselves in the bedroom." But Elena was already moving toward the kitchen, her face set with grim determination. She returned with the shotgun, checking its load with practiced efficiency. "If they're here for me, I won't hide behind you and Clara," she said firmly. "Elena." "No, Jacob. I've spent 14 years running from shadows. If my past has finally caught up with me, then it's time to face it." The riders reined in just outside the front door, their horses snorting and stamping in the cold. Jacob could see torches flickering through the windows, could hear the jingle of spurs and the creak of leather. "Jacob Renfield," a voice called from outside. "This is Deputy U.S. Marshal William Hayes. We need to speak with you about the woman you're harboring." Jacob felt Elena stiffen beside him. "Harboring," she whispered. "Damn it, they make it sound like I'm a criminal." "Maybe we should hear what they have to say," Jacob suggested quietly. Elena shook her head. "Jacob, if I go with them now, I'll never make it to trial. There are men who've been hunting me for 14 years, men who see me as a loose end that needs tying up. If they take me tonight, you'll never see me again." "Then what do you suggest?" Elena was quiet for a long moment, her green eyes calculating possibilities. When she spoke, her voice held a note of steel that Jacob had never heard before. "I suggest we make them work for it," she said. "I suggest we find out exactly what they know and what they want before I surrender anything to anybody." Jacob studied her face in the lamplight and saw something that made his breath catch. This wasn't the gentle nursemaid or the damaged woman seeking shelter. This was Elena Vasquez, the courier. Elena Vasquez, the survivor. Elena Vasquez, who'd spent 3 years keeping a child safe in the middle of a war. This was the woman they called the Sparrow. And for the first time since seeing that wanted poster, Jacob felt his doubts begin to fade. Because whatever Elena might have done during the war, she'd done it for the same reasons. She did everything to protect the people she loved. "Mr. Renfield," the marshal called again, "we know she's in there. Make this easy on everyone and send her out." Jacob looked at Elena, seeing his own determination reflected in her eyes. Whatever happened next, they would face it together. "Marshal Hayes," Jacob called back, "it's late and cold and you're scaring my daughter. If you want to talk, you'll do it civil-like in the morning." There was a pause, then the sound of men conferring in low, urgent voices. Finally, Hayes spoke again. "Mr. Renfield, the woman you're protecting is wanted for serious federal crimes. If you continue to harbor her, you'll be charged as an accessory." Elena stepped forward, her voice carrying clearly through the door. "Marshal Hayes, this is Elena Vasquez. If you want to discuss charges against me, you can do it properly with a lawyer present and in a courtroom. Until then, I'm under the protection of the man I'm going to marry, on land that belongs to him, and you have no legal right to demand anything." The silence that followed was pregnant with tension. Jacob could almost hear the marshal's frustration, their uncertainty about how to proceed. "Miss Vasquez," Hayes called finally, "you're making this harder than it needs to be." "No, Marshal," Elena replied. "I'm making it exactly as hard as the law requires. If you have evidence against me, present it to a judge. If you have a warrant, show it to me. If you have neither, Then I suggest you make camp somewhere warmer and come back in the morning to discuss this like civilized people." Jacob felt a surge of pride at Elena's composure, her knowledge of legal procedures that spoke of education and intelligence. This was not a woman who'd stumbled blindly into espionage. This was someone who'd chosen her path with full understanding of the risks and consequences. "Very well," Hayes said after another long pause. "But Miss Vasquez, understand this, we're not going away. We'll be watching this house, and if you try to run, we'll bring you back in chains." "I'm not running, Marshal," Elena replied calmly. "I'm getting married on Christmas Eve, and I'm not letting anyone, federal agents included, spoil my wedding day." The sound of horses moving away from the house was followed by an even more ominous silence. Jacob knew the marshals hadn't gone far, probably just to the ridgeline where they could watch the house while staying warm around a fire. "Elena," Jacob said quietly, "are you sure about this, about facing them down?" Elena hung the shotgun aside and moved to the window, peering out through a crack in the curtains. "I'm sure about you," she said simply. "I'm sure about Clara. I'm sure about the life we're building here. Everything else, the war, the charges, what I may or may not have done, that's all in the past. This is the present, Jacob. This is what matters." Jacob joined her at the window, slipping his arms around her waist from behind. "So what do we do now?" Elena leaned back against his chest, drawing strength from his solid presence. "Now we wait for morning, and we trust that 14 years of running has taught me enough about staying ahead of men like Hayes to keep us all safe until we can figure out the truth. And if we can't, if the truth is something we don't want to face." Elena turned in his arms, her green eyes blazing with determination. "Then we'll make our own truth, Jacob. We'll build a life so strong, so full of love and hope and purpose that nothing from the past can tear it down." Outside, snow began to fall again, soft and silent, covering the tracks of the federal marshals and wrapping the R Ranch in a blanket of deceptive peace. But Jacob could feel the tension in Elena's body, could see the way her eyes kept drifting to the windows, the doors, the escape routes she was cataloging out of long habit. The woman he loved was preparing for a battle that had been 14 years in the making, and come morning they would all discover whether love was strong enough to triumph over the ghosts of war, whether hope could overcome the weight of unanswered accusations, and whether a family built on trust and faith could survive the ultimate test of loyalty. The stakes, Jacob realized, had never been higher, and the game was just beginning. Dawn broke gray and cold over the R Ranch, painting the snow-covered landscape in muted shades of silver and pearl. Jacob had barely slept, his mind churning with plans and possibilities, while Elena had spent the night pacing the floor above her footsteps, a restless counterpoint to Clara's peaceful breathing. When morning finally came, it brought with it a visitor that none of them had expected. The knock on the door came just as Jacob was building up the breakfast fire, gentle but insistent. Through the frosted window he could see a lone figure on horseback, a woman in a dark traveling coat, her gray hair pulled back in a severe bun. "Jacob," Elena said quietly from the stairs where she stood fully dressed, despite the early hour. "I know that woman." "Who is she?" Elena's face had gone pale, but there was recognition in her green eyes. "That's Mrs. Catherine Morrison, Colonel Morrison's widow." Jacob's hand moved instinctively toward his rifle, but Elena shook her head. "No," she said softly. "If she meant harm, she wouldn't have come alone." Jacob opened the door to find a woman in her 60s with intelligent brown eyes and the kind of dignity that comes from surviving great loss with grace intact. She studied Elena with careful attention, as if comparing the woman before her with memories long held in her heart. "Miss Vasquez," she said finally, her voice carrying a slight southern accent. "Or do you prefer Mrs. Renfield now?" "The wedding hasn't happened yet," Elena replied quietly. "Please come in from the cold, Mrs. Morrison. You've traveled a long way." The older woman stepped inside, accepting Jacob's offer to take her coat. As she settled into a chair by the fire, Clara appeared at the top of the stairs, drawn by the sound of voices. "Clara, sweetheart, why don't you play in your room for a bit?" Elena suggested gently. "But Mama," "Please, little bird, this is grown-up talk." Clara's lower lip jutted out in protest, but she recognized the tone that meant Elena wouldn't be swayed. She trudged back upstairs with the dramatic sigh that only children could manage. Mrs. Morrison watched this exchange with keen interest. "She calls you Mama." "She does?" Elena confirmed, settling into the chair across from her unexpected visitor. "Mrs. Morrison, I won't insult you by pretending I don't know why you're here. The question is whether you've come seeking justice or revenge." The older woman's laugh was bitter. "My dear, if I wanted revenge, I would have turned you over to Marshal Hayes and his men last night, instead of warning them that I intended to speak with you first." Jacob felt Elena stiffen beside him. "You warned them." "I did. And I told them that if they interfered with my conversation with you, they would answer to the federal judge who signed their warrant." Mrs. Morrison's eyes glittered with satisfaction. Amazing how quickly federal agents become reasonable when they're reminded that their authority has limits. Elena leaned forward in her chair. "Mrs. Morrison, I need you to know I don't remember everything that happened that night. The head injury I suffered left gaps in my memory. But I do remember your husband threatening Sarah Langston, and I remember fighting to protect her." "I know," Mrs. Morrison said simply. The two words hung in the air like a revelation. Elena blinked in confusion. "You know," Mrs. Morrison reached into her reticule and withdrew a worn leather journal, its pages yellowed with age. "This was my husband's private diary. I found it among his effects after his death, and I've been carrying it ever since, waiting for the right moment to reveal its contents." She opened the journal to a page marked with a faded ribbon and began to read in her clear, cultured voice. "November 15th, 1864. I have discovered the location of the Langston child. Colonel Langston's treachery has cost the Confederacy dearly, and his daughter will serve as adequate compensation for his crimes. The nursemaid may prove troublesome, but she is a small woman and should be easily managed." Elena's face went white. "He was planning to kidnap Sarah," Mrs. Morrison nodded grimly. "November 16th, 1864. The raid on the Union camp proceeded as planned, but the nursemaid proved more resourceful than anticipated. When she realized my intentions regarding the child, she fought like a wildcat. I was forced to defend myself when she attempted to shoot me with a pistol stolen from one of my men." Jacob felt his chest tighten. "Your husband was trying to kidnap a 7-year-old girl." "November 17th, 1864. Mrs. Morrison continued reading. "I am gravely wounded and unlikely to survive the night. The nursemaid's bullet found its mark, but I do not blame her for defending the child. In truth, I have come to question the wisdom of using innocents as weapons in this war. The girl's terror haunts me, as does the knowledge that I have become the kind of man who would frighten children in service to a cause." Elena was crying now, silent tears streaming down her cheeks. "He wrote that, the final entry," Mrs. Morrison said softly. "November 18th, 1864. I die tonight, but I die with a clear conscience regarding the nursemaid. She acted with honor to protect an innocent child. If anyone reads this journal, let them know that Elena Vasquez is guilty of nothing more than courage in the face of evil. The true crime was mine for threatening a child to achieve military objectives." The parlor fell silent except for the crackling of logs in the fireplace. Elena buried her face in her hands, her shoulders shaking with the force of long-suppressed grief and guilt finally released. "For 14 years, she whispered, I've carried the weight of his death. For 14 years, I've wondered if I was a murderer." Mrs. Morrison closed the journal with a soft snap. "Miss Vasquez, my husband was many things, a soldier, a patriot, a man of strong convictions, but in his final days he was also honest about the darkness that war had brought to his soul. You freed him from that darkness by reminding him that some lines should never be crossed." Jacob moved to Elena's chair and pulled her into his arms, feeling her tears soak through his shirt. Elena, you're innocent. You were protecting a child, just like you've always done. But the wanted posters, Elena said through her tears, the federal agents are operating on incomplete information, Mrs. Morrison said firmly. They know my husband died during a raid on a Union camp. They know you were present when it happened, but they don't know the context, the circumstances, the truth of what really occurred. She stood up, her dignity intact despite the emotional weight of her revelations. Miss Vasquez, I came here not just to clear your name, but to thank you. You see, my husband's final entries in that journal helped me understand that he died as the man I married, not the stranger he had become during the war. You gave him back his honor in his final moments, and for that I am in your debt. Elena looked up, her eyes red but clear. What will you do now? Will you share the journal with the federal agents? I will share it with the world, if necessary, Mrs. Morrison said resolutely. But first, I believe you have a wedding to attend to. As if summoned by her words, the sound of approaching horses filled the morning air. But this time the riders weren't federal marshals. Jacob recognized the voices of Tom Brennan and his wife Sarah, followed by several other neighbors who had decided to brave the snow and the controversy to attend Elena and Jacob's wedding. It's Christmas Eve, Sarah Brennan called out cheerfully as she climbed down from her wagon. And we're not letting a few federal agents spoil a good wedding. More wagons appeared over the ridge. The Henderson family from the general store, the Kowalski brothers who ran the sawmill, even old Doc Peterson, who rarely left his practice for anything less than a life-or-death emergency. It seemed that half the county had decided to make the journey to the Double R Ranch. Elena stared at the gathering crowd through the window, her face a mixture of wonder and disbelief. They came, she whispered. Even knowing about the wanted posters, the federal agents, they still came. Of course they came, Jacob said, his own voice thick with emotion. Elena, these people have watched you for months now. They've seen how you care for Clara, how you've brought life back to this ranch. Whatever mistakes the federal government might be making, these folks know who you really are. Mrs. Morrison smiled, the first genuine smile she'd worn since arriving. Miss Vasquez, it seems you've built quite a life for yourself here. Perhaps it's time you stopped running from your past and started embracing your future. The next few hours passed in a whirlwind of activity. Sarah Brennan had indeed worked miracles with her sewing machine, producing a wedding dress of simple white wool, trimmed with the precious lace from Henderson's store. Clara, beside herself with excitement, appointed herself Elena's personal attendant and took her duties with the utmost seriousness. You look like a princess, Mama, Clara declared as she helped Elena with the final adjustments to her dress. The most beautiful princess in the whole world. Elena knelt down to Clara's level, taking the little girl's hands in hers. Clara, sweetheart, I need you to understand something. There might be some difficult times ahead. People might ask questions about me, about things that happened before I came here. But no matter what anyone says, no matter what happens, I want you to remember that I love you with all my heart. Clara's blue eyes, so much like her mother's, were solemn and understanding. I know, Mama. And no matter what happens, you're still my mama, and Papa's still my papa, and we're still a family. The simple faith in Clara's words brought fresh tears to Elena's eyes. How did I get so lucky to find you? You didn't find me, Clara said, with 5-year-old wisdom. God sent you to me in the snow because he knew we needed each other. Meanwhile, in the parlor below, Mrs. Morrison was having a very different conversation with Marshal Hayes, who had arrived with 2 of his deputies just as the wedding preparations were reaching their peak. Marshal, Mrs. Morrison said coolly, I trust you've had time to review the evidence I provided. Hayes, a weathered man in his 50s with the kind of mustache that suggested military service, looked decidedly uncomfortable. Mrs. Morrison, with all due respect to your late husband's memory, a diary isn't necessarily admissible evidence in a federal court. Perhaps not, Mrs. Morrison agreed, but it is evidence of your suspect's character and motivations. Tell me, Marshal, in all your years of law enforcement, have you ever arrested someone for defending a child from kidnapping? The circumstances are complicated, Hayes admitted. Are they? Let me simplify them for you. Mrs. Morrison's voice carried the authority of a woman who had navigated Washington society during wartime. My husband attempted to kidnap a 7-year-old girl. Miss Vasquez shot him while defending that child. In any court in this nation, that would be considered justified use of force. Tom Brennan, who had been listening to this exchange with growing interest, stepped forward. Marshal Hayes, I've known Elena Vasquez for months now. I've seen how she cares for Jacob's daughter, how she's contributed to our community. Are you really going to arrest a woman for protecting a child? The law is the law, Hayes said, but his conviction was wavering. Yes, it is, Mrs. Morrison agreed, and the law says that citizens have the right to defend innocents from harm, which is exactly what Miss Vasquez did 14 years ago and exactly what she would do again if faced with the same circumstances. Before Hayes could respond, Reverend Matthews appeared in the doorway, looking somewhat sheepish. Marshal Hayes, Mrs. Morrison, I've been thinking about our conversation yesterday, and I believe I may have been hasty in my judgment. Elena, resplendent in her simple wedding dress, descended the stairs with Clara beside her. The sight of her radiant with happiness despite the uncertainty of her situation seemed to settle something in the room. Reverend Matthews, Elena said quietly, I understand your concerns about performing the ceremony. If you've changed your mind— I haven't changed my mind, my dear, Matthews interrupted. I've opened it. Mrs. Morrison has helped me understand that courage in defense of innocence isn't a crime, it's a calling. And if the federal government wants to prosecute someone for answering that calling, they'll have to explain themselves to a higher authority than I represent. Hayes threw up his hands in frustration. This is highly irregular. I have a federal warrant. You have a warrant based on incomplete information and 14-year-old assumptions, Mrs. Morrison corrected. Marshal, my husband's diary makes it clear that Miss Vasquez acted in defense of a child. Are you prepared to arrest someone for protecting an innocent? Because I assure you, the newspapers will be very interested in that story. The threat of public scrutiny seemed to give Hayes pause. He looked around the room at the gathered neighbors, all of whom were watching him with expressions ranging from curious to hostile. Furthermore, Mrs. Morrison continued pressing her advantage. I am prepared to testify on Miss Vasquez's behalf in any court proceeding, as are, I suspect, many of the people in this room who can speak to her character and her dedication to protecting children. Jacob stepped forward, his arms slipping protectively around Elena's waist. Marshal Hayes, Elena isn't going anywhere. If the federal government wants to pursue this case, they know where to find her. But today, she's getting married, and I'd like to see the man brave enough to try and stop her. The challenge in Jacob's voice was unmistakable, and Hayes seemed to recognize that he was facing a room full of people who would gladly defend Elena with their lives if necessary. This isn't over, Hayes said, finally. I'll need to contact my superiors, get clarification on how to proceed given this new evidence. You do that, Tom Brennan said cheerfully. In the meantime, you're welcome to join us for the wedding. Sarah made extra food, and there's always room for one more at a celebration. Hayes looked like he'd rather eat broken glass than attend Elena's wedding, but he managed a stiff nod. I'll consider your invitation. As the marshal and his deputies withdrew to discuss their options, the wedding preparations resumed with renewed energy. It seemed that the confrontation with federal authority had only strengthened the community's resolve to support Elena and Jacob. The ceremony itself was simple but heartfelt, conducted in the parlor with Clara serving as both flower girl and ring bearer. Elena's hand shook slightly as she spoke her vows, but her voice was clear and strong. Jacob Renfield, she said, looking into his dark eyes with absolute certainty. I promise to love you and Clara with all my heart, to stand by your side through whatever trials may come, and to be the mother and wife this family deserves. I may not remember everything about my past, but I know with absolute certainty that my future belongs with you. Jacob's own vows were equally heartfelt. Elena Vasquez, you came to us in a storm, asking for nothing but scraps and shelter. Instead, you gave us back our laughter, our hope, and our faith in tomorrow. I promise to protect you and cherish you, to trust in your goodness even when the world questions it, and to build with you a love strong enough to weather any storm. When Reverend Matthews pronounced them husband and wife, the room erupted in cheers and applause. Clara, overcome with joy, threw her arms around both her parents, simultaneously creating a family embrace that left few dry eyes in the room. The celebration that followed was everything Elena had dreamed of, and more. There was music and dancing, stories and laughter, and a sense of community that transcended the legal complications hovering at the edges of the day. Even Mrs. Morrison seemed to catch the festive spirit, regaling the younger women with stories of wartime society balls and the curious customs of Washington politics. As evening approached and the guests began to make their farewells, Marshal Hayes approached the newlyweds one final time. His manner was noticeably less aggressive than it had been that morning. Mrs. Renfield, he said, using Elena's married name with deliberate emphasis, I've discussed the situation with my superiors by telegraph. Given the new evidence provided by Mrs. Morrison and the testimony of your neighbors regarding your character, the federal government is prepared to drop all charges against you. Elena felt Jacob's arm tighten around her waist, felt Clara press closer to her side. All charges, Hayes confirmed. The death of Colonel Morrison has been reclassified as justifiable homicide in defense of an innocent. You're a free woman, Mrs. Renfield. The words seemed to echo in the suddenly quiet room. Elena had spent 14 years running from this moment, fearing it, dreading the day when her past would finally catch up with her. Now that it had, she found herself overwhelmed, not with relief, but with gratitude for the people who had stood by her when the truth finally came to light. Thank you, Marshal, she said quietly, but I was already free. These people, this family, they set me free the moment they chose to trust me despite not knowing who I was. Hayes nodded, a grudging respect in his eyes. Mrs. Renfield, for what it's worth, I think you've chosen well, both of you. As the last of the guests departed into the snowy night, the Renfield family found themselves alone at last. Clara, exhausted by the excitement of the day, had fallen asleep in Elena's lap during the evening's festivities and showed no signs of waking, despite the transition from party to quiet domesticity. I should put her to bed, Elena said softly, but she made no move to disturb the sleeping child. In a minute, Jacob said, settling beside his wife on the sofa. I just want to look at you both for a moment. My wife, my daughter, my family. Elena smiled, the expression radiant, despite her exhaustion. Mrs. Elena Renfield, it has a nice sound to it, doesn't it? It has a perfect sound to it, Jacob agreed. Elena, when you first knocked on our door, you asked for scraps and a corner to sleep. Do you remember? I remember. You gave us so much more than we ever gave you. You gave us back our lives, our hope, our future. You turned a house into a home and two lonely people into a family. Elena leaned against Jacob's shoulder, careful not to disturb Clara. We healed each other, I think. You and Clara gave me a reason to stop running a place to belong. You showed me that some kinds of love really are too deep for forgetting. Outside, fresh snow was beginning to fall, adding another layer to the white blanket that covered the Colorado high country. But inside the Double R Ranch, 3 hearts that had been broken by loss and mended by love beat in perfect harmony. From scraps and a corner to sleep, Elena had found a daughter who called her mama, a husband who loved her without reservation, and a community that had chosen to see her heart rather than her past. She had asked for so little and received everything. As Jacob carried the sleeping Clara upstairs and Elena banked the fire for the night, both of them knew that whatever challenges lay ahead, they would face them together. The past had been resolved, the present was perfect, and the future stretched before them like an unwritten story full of infinite possibility. Love, it seemed, really was stronger than memory. Hope really could triumph over fear. And sometimes, just sometimes, the storms that threatened to destroy us actually delivered exactly what our hearts needed most. In the end, Elena had stopped running, not because her past had caught up with her, but because she had finally found a place worth staying for, and that perhaps was the greatest gift of all. The first spring after their wedding brought changes to the R ranch that went far beyond the melting snow and budding trees. Elena stood in what had once been the old storehouse, watching sunlight stream through the windows Jacob had installed over the winter months. The empty space that had once held grain and tools was slowly transforming into something entirely different, something that would honor both her past and their shared future. "Mama, when will the children come?" Clara asked, her small hand slipping into Elena's as they surveyed their work. At 6 years old now, Clara had grown taller and more thoughtful, her blonde hair braided with the same careful attention Elena had once given to Sarah Langston's dark curls. "Soon, little bird," Elena replied, squeezing Clara's hand gently, "as soon as we finish preparing their classroom." The idea had come to Elena gradually over the winter months, born from the realization that there were children scattered across the territory who had no access to proper schooling. Ranch children like Clara, whose nearest school was 15 miles away through mountain passes that could turn deadly without warning. Children whose parents couldn't spare them from daily chores long enough for a proper education. Children who deserved the same chances that Sarah Langston had been given, despite the circumstances of their birth or geography. "Elena's been corresponding with families all winter," Jacob explained to Tom Brennan, who had stopped by to see their progress. "Word's gotten out about the school, and we've got requests from as far as 50 miles away." Tom whistled low, running his weathered hand along the new bookshelves Jacob had built. "That's ambitious even for you two. You sure you're ready to take on a dozen ranch children with more energy than sense?" Elena laughed, the sound bright and confident in a way that still surprised Jacob sometimes. The woman who had arrived at their door asking for scraps had grown into someone who tackled challenges with the same fierce determination she'd once shown protecting Sarah Langston. "Tom, I spent 3 years keeping one extremely precocious 7-year-old safe and educated in the middle of a war zone," Elena said, her green eyes sparkling with humor. "I think I can handle a few ranch children in peacetime Colorado." But even as she spoke the words with confidence, Elena felt the familiar flutter of nervousness in her stomach. Teaching Clara at home was one thing the child was eager to learn, and already loved Elena unconditionally. Teaching other people's children or earning their trust and respect, proving herself worthy of their parents' faith, that was something entirely different. "You're worried," Jacob observed that evening as they worked together to set up the final details of the classroom. He'd developed an uncanny ability to read Elena's moods, to sense the shadows that occasionally crossed her mind, despite the happiness they'd built together. "A little," Elena admitted, adjusting the position of the small desks they'd arranged in neat rows. "What if I'm not good enough? What if the parents change their minds when they see me up close? Remember the stories about my past." Jacob set down the slate board he'd been mounting on the wall and crossed to where Elena stood. His hands settled on her shoulders with the gentle authority of a man who'd learned to chase away his wife's doubts with patience and unwavering support. "Elena Renfield," he said firmly, "you are going to be the finest teacher these children have ever had. You know why? Because I have experience with education," Elena suggested, though her voice held little conviction. "Because you understand what it feels like to be lost," Jacob said quietly. "You understand what it means to need someone to believe in you when you can't believe in yourself." Those children, to half of them, come from families struggling to make ends meet. The other half are convinced they're too rough around the edges for book learning. They need someone who sees potential instead of problems. Elena leaned into Jacob's embrace, drawing strength from his solid presence, as she had so many times over the past year. And you really think I'm that someone? I know you are. I've watched you turn our daughter from a frightened, silent child into a confident little girl who reads at twice her grade level and thinks she can solve any problem with enough determination. I've seen you gentle spooked horses and coax wildflowers to bloom in impossible places. If you can do all that, teaching a few eager children should be simple. Before Elena could respond, the sound of approaching wagons interrupted their conversation. Through the window, they could see lanterns bobbing in the gathering dusk. As families began arriving for the informal gathering Elena had organized to meet the parents and children who would be attending her school. "They're early," Elena said, her nervousness spiking again. "They're eager," Jacob corrected gently. "There's a difference." The first family to reach the house was the Kowalski brothers, with their combined brood of 7 children, ranging in age from 5 to 14. The children tumbled out of the wagon with the boundless energy of youth, while their fathers approached with the careful dignity of men who'd worked hard for everything they owned. "Mrs. Renfield," Stan Kowalski said, removing his hat as he approached Elena. "We can't thank you enough for doing this. These children need proper schooling, and we just haven't been able to manage it on our own." Elena felt some of her nervousness ease at the genuine gratitude in Stan's voice. "Mr. Kowalski, I'm honored that you're trusting me with your children's education. I promise you I won't take that responsibility lightly." More families arrived in quick succession: the Hendersons from the general store with their twin daughters, the Martinez family with their 3 boys who spoke Spanish at home and needed help with their English, old Wilhelm Schmidt with his granddaughter who'd been living with him since her parents died of fever the previous spring. As Elena moved among the gathered families, introducing herself and getting to know the children who would be her students, she felt something remarkable happening. These people weren't looking at her with suspicion or doubt. They were looking at her with hope. "Mrs. Renfield," Maria Martinez said quietly, pulling Elena aside as the other families mingled. "My boys, they are good children, but they struggle with the English sometimes. The other children in town, they laugh." Elena knelt down to where the 3 Martinez boys stood beside their mother, their dark eyes serious and watchful. The youngest, maybe 7 years old, reminded her painfully of Sarah Langston. The same intelligent eyes, the same careful way of assessing adult moods. "What's your name?" Elena asked the youngest boy in Spanish, her pronunciation careful but clear. His face lit up with surprise and delight. "Miguel, señora. You speak Spanish?" "Sí, Miguel. My father was Mexican and I grew up speaking both languages. Would you like to help me teach the other children some Spanish words? I think they'd be very interested to learn." Miguel's shyness evaporated instantly, replaced by excitement at the prospect of being a teacher rather than a struggling student. His older brothers, Joaquin and Carlos, exchanged glances that suggested they were beginning to see possibilities they hadn't considered before. Maria Martinez's eyes filled with tears of gratitude. "Mrs. Renfield, you don't know what this means to us." But Elena did know. She remembered all too well what it felt like to be different, to struggle with belonging, to wonder if you'd ever find a place where your differences were seen as gifts rather than burdens. As the evening progressed, Elena found herself in similar conversations with other parents. Wilhelm Schmidt worried that his granddaughter Greta was too quiet, too withdrawn since her parents' death. The Henderson twins were convinced they weren't smart enough for real schooling. The oldest Kowalski boy, 14-year-old Pavel, was sure he was too old and too rough for book learning. With each conversation, Elena felt her purpose crystallizing. These weren't just children who needed basic education. They were young people who needed someone to see their potential, to believe in their ability to grow and learn and become whatever they dreamed of being. "Children," Elena called out, gathering the young ones around her in the parlor, "I want to tell you a story about a little girl I once knew." The room quieted as children settled cross-legged on the floor, their faces turned toward Elena with the rapt attention that only children could give to a promising story. This little girl lived in a very difficult time when there was fighting and fear all around her. Elena began her voice taking on the cadence of a practiced storyteller. She was far from home, surrounded by strangers, and sometimes she felt very scared and alone. Clara, who had heard variations of Sarah's story before, settled against Elena's side with the contentment of a child who knew she was safe. "But this little girl was very special," Elena continued. "She was curious about everything, always asking questions, always wanting to learn new things. She spoke 3 languages, could recite poetry from memory, and had opinions about everything from how to properly care for horses to the best way to make coffee." Several of the older children smiled at this, recognizing themselves in the description of a child with strong opinions about practical matters. "The most important thing about this little girl," Elena said, her voice growing warmer, "was that she never gave up hope. Even when things seemed impossible, even when the adults around her were worried and scared, she kept learning, kept growing, kept believing that tomorrow could be better than today." "What happened to her?" asked Greta Schmidt, her voice barely above a whisper. Elena smiled gently at the withdrawn child. "She grew up to become exactly who she was meant to be, someone brave and kind and intelligent, someone who made the world a better place just by being in it." "Is that a true story?" Miguel Martinez asked, his English careful but clear. "It's the truest story I know," Elena replied. "And do you know what I learned from that little girl? I learned that every child has that same potential inside them. Every single one of you has the ability to become someone remarkable, someone who makes a difference in the world." She looked around the room at the collection of young faces, some confident, some uncertain, all of them precious in their uniqueness. "That's what our school is going to be about," Elena continued. "Not just learning to read and write and do arithmetic, though we'll certainly do those things. We're going to learn how to think, how to question, how to dream big dreams, and then figure out how to make them real." Pavel Kowalski, who had been leaning against the wall with teenage skepticism written all over his face, straightened up with interest. "You really think we can do that? Even kids like us?" "Especially kids like you," Elena said firmly. "Pavel, you've been helping run your family's sawmill since you were 10 years old. You understand machinery, logistics, problem solving. Those are incredibly valuable skills. What if we added reading, writing, and mathematics to that foundation? What if you could not just run a sawmill, but design better mills, write contracts with suppliers, calculate the most efficient ways to process lumber?" Pavel's eyes widened as he considered possibilities he'd never imagined. "You think I could really learn all that?" "I don't think it," Elena said with absolute conviction. "I know it." As the families began to depart with promises to return the following Monday for the first official day of school, Elena felt a sense of rightness settle in her chest. This was what she'd been moving toward all her life. Not the war, not the running, not even the personal happiness she'd found with Jacob and Clara, though that remained precious beyond measure. This was her purpose, to take children who had been told they were too poor, too foreign, too rough, too quiet, or too different, and show them that they were exactly what the world needed them to be. "You did well tonight," Mrs. Morrison said quietly. The elderly woman had moved to a small house in town after the wedding, but she'd become a regular visitor to the ranch and an unofficial advisor to Elena's educational endeavors. "Those children adore you already." "They don't know me yet," Elena protested. "Tonight was easy stories and dreams and possibilities. Wait until we get to the hard work of actual learning." Mrs. Morrison smiled with the wisdom of someone who'd lived through war and loss and reconstruction. "My dear, I've watched you with Clara for over a year now. I've seen how you make learning feel like an adventure rather than a chore. Those children are going to thrive under your guidance." As Elena locked up the new schoolhouse and made her way back to the main house, she found Jacob waiting for her on the front porch, despite the cool evening air. "How do you feel?" he asked, slipping his arm around her waist as they stood, looking out at the star-filled sky. "Terrified," Elena admitted. "Excited, hopeful, completely overwhelmed." She paused, considering, "like I'm about to attempt something impossible that absolutely has to be done." Jacob chuckled, the sound warm and proud. "That sounds about right for Elena Renfield. You've never been one to choose the easy path." "No," Elena agreed, leaning into her husband's solid warmth. "But Jacob, what if I fail them? What if I can't give these children what they need?" "Then you'll figure out what they do need and find a way to provide it," Jacob said simply. "Elena, do you remember what you told me that first night when you were half dead from cold and exhaustion?" Elena thought back to that storm-tossed evening that felt like a lifetime ago. "I asked for scraps and a corner to sleep." "You did. And look what grew from those humble beginnings. You asked for so little and gave us so much in return. These children are going to experience the same kind of transformation, I guarantee it." The first day of school arrived with the kind of crisp April morning that promised warmth later but still held winter's bite in the shadows. Elena stood in her classroom, checking and rechecking the supplies she'd arranged, fighting the familiar flutter of nervousness in her stomach. Clara, resplendent in her best dress, and with her hair braided with extra care, was practically vibrating with excitement. "Mama, when will the other children get here? Do you think they'll like our classroom? Did you remember to put out the Spanish books for Miguel?" "Yes, sweetheart, I remembered everything," Elena said, smoothing Clara's hair with hands that trembled only slightly. "And the other children will be here soon." They came in a steady stream over the next half hour, some delivered by parents who lingered to offer last-minute encouragements and concerns, others walking or riding alone with the self-sufficiency of children raised on isolated ranches. By 8 o'clock, Elena found herself facing 12 young people whose ages ranged from Clara's 6 years to Pavel's 14, whose backgrounds encompassed 3 different languages and economic circumstances that ranged from comfortable to barely scraping by. "Good morning, everyone," Elena said, her voice carrying clearly through the sunny classroom. "Welcome to our school. I want to start by telling you that this classroom belongs to all of us. This is a place where questions are always welcome, where mistakes are part of learning, and where every single person's ideas and experiences matter." She moved to the slate board where she'd written her name in careful script. "I'm Mrs. Renfield, but in this classroom you may call me Miss Elena, if that feels more comfortable. Now I'd like each of you to tell us your name, how old you are, and one thing you're excited to learn about this year." The introductions revealed the delightful complexity of her new students. Miguel Martinez, now brave with Elena's encouragement, wanted to learn to read English stories as well as he could read Spanish ones. The Henderson twins, Sarah and Ruth, were fascinated by the idea of learning about other countries. Pavel Kowalski surprised everyone by admitting he wanted to learn about poetry, something he'd been secretly curious about but had never dared to admit. But it was Greta Schmidt who touched Elena's heart most deeply. The quiet 9-year-old, when her turn came, whispered so softly that everyone had to lean in to hear her. "I want to learn how to be brave," Greta said, her pale blue eyes fixed on her hands, folded in her lap. Elena felt her throat tighten with emotion. "Greta, that's the most important thing anyone could want to learn. And do you know what? I think you're already braver than you realize." Greta looked up in surprise, and Elena saw in her eyes the same mixture of hope and disbelief that had once lived in Sarah Langston's face. "You walked into this classroom even though you were nervous," Elena continued gently. "You told us something true about yourself, even though it was scary to share. Those are both very brave things to do." As the morning progressed, Elena watched her students begin to relax and engage with the material she'd prepared. She'd designed the first lessons to be collaborative and interactive, focusing more on getting to know each other and establishing classroom expectations than on rigorous academic work. But even in these introductory activities, she could see the different strengths and challenges each child brought. Carlos Martinez had a natural gift for mathematics, but struggled with reading comprehension. Sarah Henderson was a voracious reader, but became anxious when asked to speak in front of the group. Pavel had obviously been told he wasn't school material so many times that he approached every task with defensive skepticism. During the lunch break, as the children ate sandwiches and played in the yard outside the schoolhouse, Elena found herself talking with Greta, who had lingered inside rather than joining the boisterous games her classmates had organized. "Greta, would you like to help me prepare for this afternoon's lesson?" Elena asked gently. The little girl nodded eagerly, clearly grateful for something to do that didn't require navigating the complex social dynamics of playground interaction. "We're going to read a story about a girl who moves to a new place where everything is different," Elena explained as she and Greta arranged books on each desk. "Have you ever had to be somewhere new and strange?" Greta's hands stilled on the book she was holding. "When Mama and Papa died, I had to go live with Grandpapa. Everything was different. Even the house smelled different." Elena's heart ached for this child, who'd lost so much at such a young age. "That must have been very frightening." "It was. And I didn't know how to talk to Grandpapa. He's nice, but he doesn't know about braiding hair or singing lullabies or any of the things Mama used to do." Elena knelt down beside Greta's chair, bringing herself to the child's eye level. "Greta, can I tell you a secret?" The little girl nodded solemnly. "I used to take care of a little girl who had lost her mama too. And do you know what I learned? Sometimes the people who love us don't know exactly how to show it, especially when they're sad too, but that doesn't mean the love isn't there. Do you think Grandpapa really loves me, even though I'm not very brave or interesting?" Elena felt tears prick at her eyes. "Oh, sweetheart, your grandfather absolutely loves you, and you are both brave and interesting. You're just discovering those things about yourself." That afternoon's reading lesson became something magical as Elena guided her students through a story about resilience and adaptation. She watched Greta slowly come out of her shell as she realized that the fictional protagonist shared many of her own fears and struggles. She saw Pavel's defensive walls begin to crumble as he discovered that poetry could be about real things like work and family and the beauty of mountain landscapes. By the end of the first week, Elena knew without doubt that she'd found her calling. These children, with their diverse backgrounds and eager minds, challenged her to be creative, patient, and endlessly resourceful. Each day brought new discoveries about what motivated them, what scared them, and what they were capable of achieving when someone believed in their potential. "You're transforming them," Jacob observed one evening as they watched Clara help Miguel with his English homework, while Pavel read a book of poetry aloud to Greta and the Henderson twins. "But I think they're transforming you too." Elena looked around at the scene in their parlor, which had become an extension of the classroom, as students frequently stayed after official school hours for extra help, or simply because they enjoyed the atmosphere of learning and discovery. "They're teaching me as much as I'm teaching them," Elena agreed. "Miguel's questions about language are making me think about words in ways I never have before. Pavel's insights into the poetry we read are absolutely brilliant. And Greta?" Elena smiled as she watched the formerly withdrawn child giggling at something Sarah Henderson had whispered to her. "Greta is discovering that she's not only brave, but also funny and kind and full of wonderful ideas." As spring turned to summer and the first year of Elena's school drew to a close, the transformation in her students was remarkable. Miguel had become fluent enough in English to serve as a translator for other Spanish-speaking families in the area. Pavel had not only embraced his love of literature, but had begun writing his own poems about life in the Colorado Territory. The Henderson twins had developed a passion for geography, and were planning to create a detailed map of their region over the summer break. But it was Greta's metamorphosis that touched Elena most deeply. The quiet, withdrawn child had blossomed into a confident young girl who asked thoughtful questions, stood up for her friends, and had even begun helping her grandfather with the more complex aspects of running his small ranch. "Mrs. Renfield," Greta said on the last day of school, approaching Elena's desk with a carefully wrapped package, "I made something for you." Elena opened the gift to find a small sampler embroidered with shaky but determined stitches. "To Miss Elena, who taught me how to be brave. Thank you for seeing me." Elena had to excuse herself for a moment, to compose herself, so overwhelmed was she by the simple eloquence of Greta's gratitude. The end-of-year celebration brought parents and community members from miles around to see what Elena's students had accomplished. There were recitations and demonstrations, displays of artwork and writing, and presentations about everything from local geology to the history of their family's immigration to Colorado. But the moment that defined the entire experience for Elena came when Pavel Kowalski, the 14-year-old who had been convinced he was too old and too rough for education, stood before the assembled crowd and recited a poem he'd written about the landscape they all called home. "These mountains that seemed like walls to me have become windows to what I can be. The teacher who saw beyond my doubt helped me find what I'm about. In books and learning, I found my voice. Now I know I have a choice to be more than I thought I could, to do more than I ever should. Have dared to dream was possible when I thought I was just a fool who worked with wood and nothing more. Now I know what learning's for, to open up the world so wide and let us see what's there inside. Each mountain peak and valley low, each person that we come to know." The applause that followed Pavel's recitation was thunderous, but Elena barely heard it over the sound of her own heart pounding with pride and joy. This young man who had walked into her classroom convinced he had nothing to offer the world of ideas, had discovered not only his own intellectual gifts, but his ability to express them with beauty and power. As the celebration wound down and families began to make their farewells, Elena found herself surrounded by parents expressing gratitude and children making promises to keep reading and learning over the summer break. "Miss Elena," Miguel Martinez said, tugging on her skirt to get her attention, "will you really be here when school starts again in the fall?" Elena knelt down to Miguel's level, smiling at this bright boy who had taught her so much about the courage it took to learn in a second language. "I'll be here, Miguel. This is my home and you are my students. I wouldn't dream of being anywhere else." That night, as Elena and Jacob sat on their front porch, watching the sunset paint the mountains in shades of gold, and Rose, Elena reflected on the journey that had brought her to this moment. "Jacob," she said quietly, "do you remember what I told Clara about some kinds of love being too deep for forgetting?" "I remember. I think I understand now what that really means. It's not just about remembering the people we've loved and lost. It's about carrying forward the best parts of those relationships, letting them inform how we love the people in our lives now." Elena thought about Sarah Langston, the bright little girl whose memory had haunted her for so many years. "Sarah taught me that children are capable of extraordinary things when someone believes in their potential. Now I get to honor that lesson every day with my students." Jacob reached over and took Elena's hand, intertwining their fingers with the easy intimacy of people who'd built their love on a foundation of mutual respect and shared purpose. "And what about us?" he asked gently. "What have we taught each other?" Elena considered the question seriously. "You taught me that home isn't a place, it's the people who see you completely and love you anyway. You and Clara taught me that family isn't just about blood. It's about choosing to commit to each other's happiness and growth day after day." "And what did you teach us?" Elena smiled, thinking about Clara asleep upstairs, dreaming of next year's adventures in learning, and about the 12 students who would return in the fall, with minds open to new possibilities. "I hope I taught you that it's never too late to start over," she said finally, "that asking for help isn't weakness, it's the first step toward becoming who you're meant to be, and that sometimes the most broken people have the most to give if someone is willing to see past the damage to the heart underneath." As the stars began to appear in the darkening sky, Elena felt a deep sense of completion. She had started this journey asking for scraps and a corner to sleep, convinced she had nothing to offer except her willingness to work. Instead, she had discovered that her experiences, both the beautiful and the terrible, had prepared her to give other people exactly what they needed most. Someone who understood struggle, who believed in second chances, and who would never stop fighting for the potential she saw in every human being. The schoolhouse stood silent in the gathering darkness, but it was full of promise for the adventures that would begin again in September. And Elena Renfield, formerly Elena Vasquez, formerly known as the Sparrow, settled into her husband's embrace, knowing that she had finally found the place where all her various identities could coexist in harmony. She was a wife and mother, a teacher and mentor, a woman with a complicated past and an unlimited future. She was exactly who she was meant to be, and she was home.